What's up, and welcome back to another episode of Keeping Up with Commanders. I'm your host, Mason Kinnahan, and I'm coming to you after Dan Quinn and Adam Peters' end-of-season press conference. I wanted to wait a little bit for this week's episode, recording not after the Week 18 game, but after a locker cleanout day for the Washington Commanders here on this Monday, January 5th. And we did learn quite a bit from Dan Quinn and Adam Peters' press conference. There was a lot to talk about. It went on for about 40 or so minutes. A lot of questions being asked, a lot of, answers that people are looking for after a horrible season overall for the Washington Commanders in 2025. And yes, the Commander season ended on a win against the Eagles. We'll get into that in the second half of this episode, but I mainly wanted to focus on Dan Quinn and Adam Peters' press conference because this is pretty much the big talking point heading into this offseason, because really no one cares that much about the game at this point, because in the grand scheme of things, the game on Sunday didn't really matter that much beyond draft position. But let's jump into Dan Quinn and Adam Peters' press conference. It was the first time we heard from Adam Peters since, I believe, Terry McLaurin signed the contract extension, and the first time basically we've heard from Peters since since before the season, I believe, was the last time. It's been a while. It's really been a while. But, overall, though, they were looking for answers from Adam. And you could tell the reporters mainly as well throughout the press conference. A lot of the questions were directed towards Adam just because, again, we don't hear from him a ton. And what he does say when he does talk is kind of important because it's really hard to get stuff out of him. There was a lot to talk about with Adam Peters. Dan Quinn also answered a few questions as well. But overall, we didn't really. I mean, there were some answers, some good quotes, but you could tell they're still very, very conservative with how they speak and the things that they're willing to discuss when they're talking to the media, especially with Adam Peters, because that's something that we've learned from him ever since he became the general manager with Washington. Is he keeps a lot of the stuff to himself, and they're looking for something, some answers from Peters, someone who is supposed to take this roster to the next level, and coming off of a year where this team makes the NFC Championship game. Wins a couple of playoff games, and Jane Daniels, of course, wins the Offensive Rookie of the Year. A 5-12 season for Washington is not the answer. So let's jump right into the quotes here from Adam Peters, or at least the stuff that stood out to me the most. We'll start with some of the stuff he said at the beginning, because some of the most important questions came at the beginning. We'll start with Dan Quinn. He opened basically the end-of-season presser stating that they're going to be evaluating things on the coaching staff. No decisions have been made as of now. That was another reason why I wanted to wait on this episode, because there is a pretty large chance, or a pretty high chance, that I would assume Joe Witt is going to be gone as defensive coordinator, because play calling duties were taken away, and they're definitely going to be in the market in the defensive coaching staff room, because that unit just massively disappointed once more. Not only did it disappoint in year one, which also, people don't really talk about it a ton, but, that's one of the main reasons why Washington could not beat the Eagles, and Washington, lost a lot of their games back in 2024 was because of that defense. That defense was really bad. And then it got worse this year. I know injuries played a role, but even when the majority of the defense was healthy towards the end of the season, things never really got better. And that was pretty much that. So I would expect Joe Witt to again be gone in some capacity. Now, one thing that I kind of learned from this press conference, and we've kind of been able to learn from Dan Quinn, is it is hard for him to move on from coaches that he really likes. And Joe Witt is a coach that he really likes. That's a good friend of Dan Quinn. And I look at, this is going to be an example. Again, I'm a Florida Gators fan, so I look at what Billy Napier had with the Florida Gators in the last, 3 or 4 years. Billy brought all of his coaches that he had from Louisiana, where he coached before in the Sun Belt, and refused to fire any of them, even when things got really bad. Now, I'm not saying this is the Billy Napier's Dan Quinn. I think Dan Quinn is a lot better of a coach than Billy Napier is, but you don't want to start falling into that trap of holding on to these relationships, or being afraid to make decisions based off of ruining a relationship. Once you get into that, things go downhill, and that's how we've seen, Black Monday today in the NFL. All these coaches get fired. The Gannons, Stefanski was a surprise, but Raheem Morris as well yesterday. So you're going to end up fired if you're refusing to make moves based on keeping, a relationship with someone. And if you don't know how to, fire someone when things are going bad, but being able to continue to maintain a good relationship with them, then that's not really going to work out. So I'm starting to get a little bit concerned about, Dan Quinn's relationship with a guy like Joe Witt, and how he never fired him in the middle of the season. He took away his play calling duties. So again, that's also something to note. Now, I don't know if there was someone that they felt confident enough to replace him in terms of the on the defensive coordinator side, but it is definitely because that plays a role as well. But it is definitely a little bit of a eyebrow raiser of what Dan Quinn refusing to get rid of Witt in the middle of the season, and taking him that long as well to take away his play calling duties was also something that I found a little bit interesting. So we'll see if Joe Witt remains on the staff. I think we'll probably find an answer in the coming days, but we'll see what happens with Joe Witt. I'd assume Washington goes and tries to find a new defensive coordinator. Dan Quinn was asked about the potential of him potentially remaining as the play caller, or remaining more in the defensive side of the play calling system and all that for Washington next year. And Dan Quinn he's keeping all of his options open, which is not, that encouraging if you're a fan, because things didn't really get better on the defensive side of the ball once Dan Quinn started calling plays. And I think I would much rather personally have Dan Quinn as the head coach and not as a defensive play caller. But it is definitely something to monitor, because Washington should be definitely in the market for a new defensive coordinator. And if they're not, that is a very, very poor decision, in my opinion, on Dan Quinn's side of things. Also important to note that in the press conference, Adam Peters was asked how involved he is in making coaching staff decisions, such as, firing and hiring a new defensive coordinator. And Adam Peters has reiterated, like he has said in the past, that he's not involved in the decisions on the coaching staff. That is a thing that is run by Dan Quinn. He can give advice, and he's there to, support Dan Quinn's decisions, but overall he is not involved in who to hire, who is hired on the coaching staff, and I shouldn't say he's not involved. He is involved, but he's not making the decisions on who Dan Quinn hires and who he fires and that type of stuff. So that is also important to note as well. Other things in the press conference that stood out to me. Adam Peters was asked about a lot of people asked him about how what he has learned from the situation with Terry McLaurin from the summer. Again, Terry McLaurin holding out for a majority of training camp, coming back with only about 2 weeks to go, and fully practicing for only about just over a week before the season opened, or in week one. Ultimately, McLaurin's season is limited heavily by injuries. And McLaurin, let me check, but he finished the season after getting his extension with 582 yards and 3 touchdowns on 38 catches. So a very disappointing year based on, expectations for 17. But a lot of it was also limited due to the injuries. Now, were the injuries caused by him not being able to practice for majority of the offseason, or at least practicing with the team? You can't really confirm or deny that, but that is definitely something to take a look at as a potential cause. But yeah, it is. Adam Peters emphasized that what he learned from that entire situation was that he wants to start the process earlier on contract extensions, and wants to start the process quicker. Which, again, who could have seen that one coming, right? I think this is now we're going to learn a lot about what Peters does with Laramie Tunsil, who is due for a contract extension this offseason and deserves one 100%, will most likely get top-end tackle money. And recently on Sunday, Charles Cross for Seattle landed $26.1 million a year. which is a lot of money for Charles Cross. And that kind of, once more, raises up the price for one of the best left tackles in the league, in my opinion, in Laremy Tunsil. I believe Tunsil deserves to be on the All-Pro list this year. He was not elected as a Pro Bowler, which shocked me when that stuff came out. But he has been one of the best left tackles, if not the best left tackle this season. And he deserves all the money that they can get. So I hope that Adam Peters can get ahead of this early. He said that he has talked with Laremy Tunsil about, contract talks and extensions and money and all of that so far. We'll see how quick that process moves for a guy like Tunsil. Someone that, may actually be wanting to hold off a little bit, as some other left tackles are up this year for potential extensions as well. So we'll see what that process brings for Washington, but I believe that they should get a contract extension done with Tunsil as soon as they can. That was something that really limited Terry's practice and all that earlier in the summer and limited his play this season, it really felt like. So Adam Peters, again, someone who comes back from that San Francisco background, and in San Francisco, they are very known for waiting on these extensions and getting them done only a week or two before the season begins. And when you do wait that long, the price really, we've learned, only goes up. And in a case like this with Tunsil and the amount of money that you're about to give him that he 100% deserves, you got to get it done as soon as possible. You really do. So that was definitely something that I wanted to talk about. Adam Peters was asked about free agency, and in the first couple of years in the Peters and Quinn regime, how they've really only given 1 or 2 year deals to a lot of different free agents. And they've given a few 3-year deals. You look at Frankie Louvu, Javon Kinlaw, but there's still, a lot more 1 or 2 year deals. Bobby Wagner, for example, Zach Ertz, stuff like those guys like that, Austin Eckler. He was asked about, how do you balance giving out these short-term contract extensions to the longer terms contracts that give out a lot of money in free agency for potentially better players. And I thought Peters answered this in a great way. He could have just said that, you build a team through the draft, which he has kind of relied on so far in his regime. And that's kind of his mindset, is you build through the draft first. That's how we see successful teams be built in the NFL. But what he said is, in past places I've been, the biggest mistakes made is investing a lot of years into a player you don't know. And I thought this was a great answer from Peters, because it is most of the time when you see a team hand out a boatload of money in free agency to a free agent, it doesn't usually end well. Or I look at, I don't know, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Maybe like a Gabe Davis, right, with Jacksonville. That didn't end well. They released him. And others. There's others too. But Calvin Ridley in Tennessee, right? He got a lot of money, but that hasn't really gone well in Tennessee. So more times than not, I feel like when you sign a big free agent, especially one that is, coming off of a breakout year to a big time long-term extension, they rarely see to the last year of that contract. And this is a big year for Washington in terms of free agency, because there's a lot of good potential targets for Washington on offense. I'm staring right at Alec Pierce as probably the guy that Washington fans really want on this roster, the wide receiver for the Colts, who is coming off of a breakout year, over 1,000 yards on only like 40 catches or something crazy like that. So it is, he's gonna make a lot of money in free agency, but he's coming off of a year that, how often do you see receivers with 40 or 50 catches for over 1,000 yards? You don't see that a lot often. Is that sustainable? Those are questions that Adam Peters and that front office should be asking themselves. So I thought that answer was really good from Peters. Other news: Adam Peters says he doesn't anticipate Zach Ertz to be ready for the beginning of the 2026 season. It really felt like he said that there was 3 guys on the roster currently, I believe, that are under contract, and that is right, with Ertz only on this 1-year deal here. Sinnott, Bates, and Yankoff are the only 3 tight ends currently on the roster for next year. He says he's keeping things open at the tight end position. The tight end position, I think, really needs an upgrade. We'll get into the game in a little bit, but 82 has not been great for Washington at the tight end position. And John Bates is a great blocker, but you need to get some receiver production out of the tight end position in a Cliff Kingsbury offense. And they were not able to get that once Zach Ertz went down. So definitely a position that needs to be upgraded, I believe, this offseason. Other things, those were some of the main things. Oh, Peter said the Commanders will definitely be looking for another pass rusher when he was asked about, specific defensive needs. Tashawn Reed points out Dorrance Armstrong and Javonte Jean-Baptiste are the only edge rushers for Washington under contract. Adam Peters said, yes, with the Larry Tunsil stuff, that, yeah, we definitely want to get something done sooner rather than later. Again, that's always the hope. Doesn't always happen, but is always the hope. And then I think that was it. But Peter's saying that there was constant communication with Tunsil, just going back to that topic real quick, was huge to me. I feel like, how many times did we hear from Peters that they weren't really talking with Terry McLaurin throughout the summer? And how many reports from, John Keim or whoever about how they didn't talk for a good month in between OTAs and between training camp starting. Adam Peters never talked to Terry McLaurin, which was, again, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. So Peters being in constant communication with Tunsil and his team about an extension is great. I believe Tunsil is self-represented. So that is something to point out. We're always trying to get younger, faster. That'll be a big emphasis for us this season. I thought was important, but that was pretty much it. I think the biggest takeaways is no decisions have been made about the coaching staff as of right now. But again, things are still going to be up in the air. I would probably expect Joe Witt to Washington to at least look for a new defensive coordinator. Maybe Joe Witt stays on as an analyst role, but I would look for, Washington to bring in a new defensive coordinator at least. There have been rumors about, I know, Anthony Lynn potentially taking the running back job at Penn State. At least that's what it says currently on his Wikipedia page. So he could be gone, and Washington could be looking for a new running backs coach as well. But there will definitely be some coaching changes, because when you go 5-12, there has to be coaching changes. And so that'd be something to look for in the next few weeks. But yeah, that was pretty much it from the press conference. Some other things that happened today. Commanders signed 11 players to futures contracts. Some names included Ja'Cory Brooks, Jacoby Jones, those two wide receivers, Rob McDaniel, who was a UDFA, and Tim McKay. A couple of UDFAs that they signed, Carlin Vigors as well. So some UDFAs that they signed to pretty hefty signing bonuses after the draft last year. Darius Rush was a name that I was looking at. Rush was pretty much on the practice squad for a good majority of the time through the second half of the season. And, he was someone that was a former, third-round pick, fourth-round pick by the Colts, or Ravens, someone like that. So he's a very athletic player that I think, if he's on this team come training camp, I think he could definitely be, one of the guys to potentially watch in the cornerback room, especially with how weak the back end of this cornerback room really is. So definitely some things to point out, I would say. But yeah, let's move on though. That'll pretty much wrap up the press conference today from Peters and Quinn. I thought it was really important to, include that in this week's episode. But let's move on to the game against the Eagles. I'm not going to talk about it much because, again, Washington wins. They now have the 7th overall pick. A loss would have given them the 5th overall pick, so not that much of a difference in a quarterback, really a weak quarterback class, I would say, especially if guys like Dante Moore don't declare and Ty Simpson as well. It doesn't really matter in terms of the trading back, because no one's going to pay premium to trade up for a non-quarterback. And I think I'd really just want Washington to select the best player available on the defensive side of the ball. So that is kind of where I'm at with that stuff. 5th and 7th is not that big of a difference to me. But for the game itself, again, Washington won 24-17 against Philadelphia. They came back to win this game as well, scoring 14 in the fourth quarter. Some players that stood out to me, I thought Jeremy Reeves had a nice interception, a couple pass breakups from him. Other news, Terry had an okay game. Traylon Brooks had a couple of catches. Look, there's been some talks about Traylon Burks, and I've seen some fans on Twitter be like, "Oh, Burks needs to be on this roster next year," and I agree. I would love to have Burks on this roster next year, but having Burks on this roster next year doesn't mean that they're okay not letting the wide receiver room improve, or it doesn't having Burks on the roster does not account for a significant addition to this wide receiver room, which this wide receiver room needs, because Deebo Samuel sounds like he's out the door. He's a free agent this offseason. We'll see what happens with him, but it sounds like he's going to be gone. Washington's going to need to upgrade that wide receiver room because Adam Peters and Dan Quinn, they said in the press conference, I think it was Peters who said it, they just did not expect Terry and Noah Brown's injuries to go on for as long as they did. And that was a major hit to Washington's offense and what Washington was trying to run with Cliff Kingsbury's offense throughout the season with Jaden and with whoever was at quarterback. So that is something to look at. Other news, I thought, Bill had one good run maybe, but he was pretty much stuffed by Philadelphia's defensive line. 13 carries for 29 yards from him. Chris Rodriguez is someone that I think could really be an impactful player in the future for Washington's running back room. 16 carries for 65 yards and a touchdown for Rodriguez. I don't know exactly what Washington intends to do at the running back position. Now, I know Rachaad White, running back for the Bucs, who's an upcoming free agent, really wants to be a Washington Commander and pair up with his former Arizona State teammate, Jane Daniels, next season. But you look at Bill's year, 805 yards, averaged 4.6 yards per carry, 8 touchdowns. He did fumble 3 times, and he lost 2 of them. But a really, really solid year from a 7th-round pick. And then for Chris Rodriguez, in his year, again, a former 6th-round pick in 2023, 112 carries for 500 yards, 6 touchdowns, a really solid power back, short yardage back for Washington. I think adding Rachaad White and calling it a day with this running back room is really solid. I don't think this running back room needs to add a premier talent, and I think they have a really solid running back duo, and if you add White in there, kind of replace Austin Eckler, and I think if Austin Eckler stayed healthy, this running back room would have been really, really solid this year and be a positive, and it kind of was in some ways, wasn't in others, but a running back room with Rachaad White, Bill Krosky-Merritt, and Chris Rodriguez, I think that's a great running back by committee trio. And, White's there for the receiving side of things. You got Rodriguez with the power and Bill with the speed. I think that's a great 3-headed monster right there. Now, again, is the best running backs in the NFL? No. But I think that is a great running back by committee, and each one of them kind of brings a different element to their game. Other notes, defensively, Von Miller, still very good at football. We'll see what happens with him this offseason, but I would love to have him back next year. I think if he's in there as what his role was meant to be, he can still put up some really solid numbers. And this year, he made $1 million on that 1 sack I think he had. He finished the year with 9 sacks for Von Miller. And that is great for someone who is 36 years old, who Washington signed in training camp. I think they definitely need to bring him back. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the only defensive ends, edge rushers under contract, Dorrance Armstrong, who actually looked really solid before his season-ending injury, Javonte Jean-Baptiste, who was injured for most of the year and quickly had a season-ending injury. And then if you bring back Von Miller, I still feel like this room needs a guy, needs a guy who is at that Dorrance Armstrong level or better, in order for this room to be really solid. But I think if you have Von Miller plus Armstrong plus a couple of other guys, like maybe Jacob Martin, you bring him back. I thought he was really solid in pass rush. I think this unit could do some damage next year. But you definitely need to add a top dog in this room, because right now this room doesn't have that top dog. But Von Miller as a complementary piece, if he can repeat what he had this year, next year, would be amazing. It really would. But yeah, overall, that is pretty much what I've got on the game itself. Jake Moody missing a chip shot and then knocking it down from 56. Again, is kind of what you get from Jake Moody. But Jake Moody is also someone that I feel like he was really consistent for Washington down the stretch. I believe that was his only miss. Yeah, the chip shot was his only miss since he became a Washington Commander, I believe. Yeah, since he became a Washington Commander, that was his only miss. So I would love to have him back next year. I think, he's got a powerful leg, knocked it down from 56, which was this season long. But I think he can really, he has a leg that can score from beyond 50. And that was something that Matt Gay just did not have this season. All right, let's wrap things up. Here. I realized I did not create a graphic. Apparently, I didn't finish making the graphic. It's supposed to say final thoughts on disastrous season, but we'll just run it. All right. This is the type of season Washington had. Final thoughts on disastrous season, but I didn't finish the graphic. All right, here we go. Overall it was a letdown, and I was really checked out after a couple of months because this team, it was the same issues every week and the same, the injuries just got worse and worse as the season went on. But I think there are a lot of things to like for Washington moving forward. There's some key pieces, especially in this past draft, that really stood out to me. Trey Amos was one of them. I feel like him next year is going to be great. Josh Connolly as well. I feel like Washington has that tackle duo, especially if they can get Tunsil on that long-term extension soon. Washington has that tackle duo for the foreseeable future. And, some of that 2024 class still needs to step up. Ben Sinnott, I really feel like could be on the chopping block next year when we get to training camp. I feel like, Sainristil definitely needs to pick things up. He's kind of the only guy that can create turnovers, but especially in the red zone, he needs to get better. And then like guys like Luke McCaffrey, whose season was cut short, but he started playing well towards the back end of things. And again, Jalen Lane as well. His season was cut short as well. So there are some things to really like from this Washington team, but overall, it was a 5-12 and a disaster, or a disastrous year for Washington. So, with the graphic messed up and all, that'll wrap up this week's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. The next episode will probably be out when Washington hires a defensive coordinator or when Washington does something important. I'm probably going to take the week off unless Washington has some major news. Firing Joe Witt is not major news to me because I feel like that's going to happen. But once Washington makes a move, will probably be when the next episode comes out. But yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in to Keeping Up with the Commanders throughout this regular season. I know it was a pretty bad year from Washington overall, but some things to look forward to here in free agency with a lot of money for Washington in cap space, and then the draft as well. We'll see what Adam Peters is going to do because I feel like he'll definitely be making some moves based on the draft picks Washington currently has. But that'll wrap up this week's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. See you guys next one. Peace.